My name is Doug Helton, and I'm the Regional Operations Supervisor for NOAA's Emergency Response Division.
From what I've learned at this conference, you are an oil spill czar. Like, how many oil spills have you responded to in your life?
Well, I've been on scene for maybe 20 or 30, but I've managed or worked in our war room in Seattle on hundreds.
You gave us some stats. Do you have those in your head? I should have asked you before, but it was shocking to me. How many a week, how many a year?
Well, in the United States, there's about 8,000 spills, 8 to 10,000 spills that are reported annually. My office responds to a small subset, about 100 to 200 spills a year, where there's more complicated science issues and the Coast Guard needs a scientific input into their response.
What is the worst oil spill in the United States so far?
Well, Deepwater Horizon was one of the biggest ones. You know, what's the worst is not necessarily the biggest in terms of gallons, but Deepwater Horizon is right up there. Exxon Valdez was very significant because of its location. Deepwater, very significant because of its size. There's been some big terrestrial spills over the years as well.
What about the Great Lakes?
The Great Lakes, there have been some big incidents. The Kalamazoo River was close to 1 million gallons of oil spilled. I recall there was a tanker accident called the Jupiter, a tanker that caught fire and exploded in the Great Lakes. That was a while ago, right? That was back in the 1980s, I believe. There's been some big tank farm failures, like in Ohio. There was a big tank farm that the tank collapsed and caused a big spill.
You know, what's different about the Great Lakes is we're contained. The ocean, an oil spill happens, it goes out into the world. Great Lakes, it stays in the Great Lakes pretty much, so it could go down the St. Lawrence Seaway. What is, are we ready for the possibility of an oil spill in the Great Lakes, and how bad would it be if we had a major oil spill? What would be different about one here than versus the ocean?
There's a couple of differences. The biggest one is that the Great Lakes are a drinking water resource for millions of people. So we don't have that issue in marine spills. So right away, there's a public health issue, immediate public health issue that could arise. And so responders are going to be very sensitive to making sure that any drinking water resources are protected, and those that are affected would be closed or managed very carefully to protect those resources.
You know that we have a controversial pipeline called Line 5 underneath the Straits of Mackinac. What do you know about the spills that have occurred there so far? It's sort of hard to get information on exactly how many there have been, but what's different and weird about that is it's underneath the water. If there was a spill, many people say, we wouldn't even know if there was a spill. Can you just respond to some of those concerns?
Well, anytime you transport oil, there's a risk of a spill. And it's not just in the underwater portion of the pipeline. It's my understanding that pipeline goes quite a long ways, crosses a number of rivers and creeks before it dives under the Straits of Mackinac. So any place that it crosses a body of water or even flows near a body of water, you could have a release. That said, pipelines are generally a pretty safe way of moving oil relative to other sources like moving it by rail or barge or tanker.
Is it safer to have a pipeline underneath the water than on a boat, in your opinion?
I think generally pipelines are considered safer than shipping by boat because you don't have some of the risk factors that you have with a vessel. You don't have the risk of a navigation error in a pipeline, for example. But those pipelines could cause a substantial spill, especially if there is as the system ages and as the steel and other parts of the system degrade.
You have seen human effects of an oil spill. I mean, people have died. You've seen seas and sea life be ruined by oil. I mean, how are we doing with this industry? If there's 8,000 spills a year, that's a lot. I mean, it seems like that's not a good record. What is your view of how the industry is doing as far as oil spills?
Well, remember that 8,000 incidents a year is
small ones and big
all
ones.
Different sizes. So, when you put gasoline in your lawnmower and you spill a little bit, some are quite small. Like I said, oil, anytime you move or transport oil, there's a risk of having a spill. The system overall, if you look at the number of spills per gallon transported, it's a pretty safe system, but a large accident can definitely ruin your day or your year or your environment.
How what lessons are we learning here now about, are the Great Lakes ready for something like this? What are the gaps in the holes and the things that, if you could bring your years of experience to us here in the Great Lakes, you're just kind of, some people here are just learning about this pipeline, and there's a lot of concern. They want that pipeline decommissioned. There are a lot of angry people. There's a lot of controversy right now in the state of Michigan in particular. What could you tell us about what do we need to be aware of? What needs to be done so we'll be ready in the event there is a pipeline break or spill?
Well, I think one thing to remember is that preparedness is a direction. It's not a place. You can always be more prepared. You're never going to stop preparing for an incident. You're never going to reach a point where you say, "Hey, we've done enough. We can rest now." So I think the industry and the agencies are working hard to increase preparedness. I think there's a number of issues that are of concern. One of them in the Great Lakes is that there isn't, because there haven't been big spills in the Great Lakes, there isn't as much experience both on the response side and on the research side. If you look at the history of oil spills, most of them have been in marine waters, so most of the data and research and technologies were adapted for use in marine spills. Well, the big issue that's different in the Great Lakes from most of the spills I've worked on is that the Great Lakes is a drinking water resource. So millions of people rely on the Great Lakes for water, and there's also all sorts of municipal and industrial intakes. So obviously a big concern here would be protection of those intakes, making sure that the water that they provide is clean and safe for all the consumers.
And what about ice in winter conditions? Because that's something you just don't deal with on ocean oil spills.
Well, we do deal with ice in Alaska, and I do work in Alaska, but the risk here is that you could have a substantial spill during the wintertime and have to deal with broken ice or thin ice that's not safe to work on, and that just adds a whole different layer of complexity to any kind of response.
What is the situation right now if the dead of winter and the Great Lakes were frozen over there under the Straits of Mackinac, which has happened, and what do you do?
Well, there's different tactics for responding to oil and ice, and surprisingly, maybe it's not the dead of winter and thick ice cover that's the hardest problem. The problem is when you're dealing with the transitional seasons, when it's broken ice, where it's too thin to work on, but too thick to really navigate through. That's the tough time that responders need to be aware of. And dealing with broken ice conditions can be very challenging.